frequently now we hear it's about lactation, it's about human milk feeding, however you do it. That's taking the two people who should be absolutely centred in breastfeeding support, the mother and the baby. It's just removing them from the picture.
I'm Jane.
Hello, I'm Ruth Lewis. I'm one of the women who's been caught up in the Leche League issues that have been going on in GB over the past 12 to 18 months.
And I'm Bets.
And this is
Insightful Sisters.
Hello, Ruth, and thank you for joining us. So, Ruth, you're a breastfeeding counsellor, newsletter editor, and trustee, all for the Leche League. You did that for over a decade, and then you got dismissed by them. So, we're here tonight to talk about what happened to you. Can you start by telling us a little bit about breastfeeding, why it interested you, what your views on it are?
Yes, I've got two girls who are now young adults. I hadn't really considered doing anything but breastfeeding before I had kids, and then they arrived. And I had one of my close friends locally who took me along to an LLL meeting. Her first, she didn't want to go on her own, so I went with her, and it just felt right, breastfeeding. It's not easy, but it is something that is part of women's reproductive cycle. When you get pregnant, you give birth to a baby, and the next thing that your body is primed to do is to breastfeed that baby. So support meetings are really key, or certainly can be, to doing that, because although you can find out lots of information by talking to people, by reading books, by looking at things online, there's nothing quite like being in a room with other mothers and watching them. In our Leche League, the idea has always been, until recently, mothering through breastfeeding. And yes, breastfeeding is about the nutrition, but it's about so much more. It's about the antibodies that can help them fight off illnesses. And it's also about security. It's about helping them calm down. There's hormones involved at different times of day, which will help babies go to sleep. It's got pain-killing properties, both the act of breastfeeding and breast milk, which means that when you've got a toddler who's fallen over, breastfeeding can help with that. It can help them regulate their emotions. It's just a great, amazing tool to have in your mothering toolbox. Yeah.
What do you think the Leche League offered in comparison to, say, a National Health Service? I mean, the Leche League is all over the world, isn't it? There's different. Is it different chapters? Do you say, or?
Yeah, depending where in the world you are, you call it a different thing. So in the UK, in GB, it's groups. We just call it groups, and LLLGB is an independent charity in the UK which is affiliated to LLL International. What LLL meetings provide, or certainly have done for decades, is a space where women can talk about what it means, what the problems are, what seems to be going wrong, or just have a moan about the lack of sleep and a baby who's wanting to feed all the time, which is really common at various points, without having someone say, have you considered giving a bottle? And that isn't what you get in most circumstances outside of somewhere like that, because bottle feeding has become not necessarily promoted now because of the protections that there are around advertising and so on, which are circumvented as much as possible by formula companies. But in theory, breastfeeding is supported. In practice, baby's behaviour is judged against what bottle feeding babies do rather than normal breastfed baby behaviour. So in terms of how frequently they feed, in terms of wanting to be held, which is a very common thing. Babies don't just need breast to be breastfed. They need to be close to their mothers. We give birth to cave babies. They haven't evolved, certainly in the few hundred years that any alternative that even could be safe has been. You don't evolve in that short length of time, which means that they're still entirely have the expectation of being close to mum the whole time, being carried around, and being breastfed frequently. And that the knowledge and the reassurance that that is normal is what you get from a breastfeeding support group that you don't necessarily get from another just general mother and baby group, I think.
And when you're sitting and you're with other mothers and you're sharing tips and you're talking about your own baby's pattern or behaviour, you won't just stop there, will you? You'll be talking
No.
about other things too. You'll be talking about the best sanitary pads and your sex life and or lack of, and it will, once you've started in a group of women on female biology, there's no stopping us, is there?
No, absolutely. It does tend to stay more around the thing that is related to the breastfeeding the baby, but absolutely it can veer off into the impact on the sex life. And the pain of having stitches in uncomfortable places and how you get around that sort of thing. And mastitis, and talking about what your nipples look like if you're breastfeeding and you have pain. One of the first questions a breastfeeding counsellor might ask is, well, what shape are your nipples after you've breastfed? You don't want to talk about that with men around. It's just not comfortable. So absolutely, yeah.
I'm interested as well in the whole issue of women and our bodies and the way we give advice to each other and how that is quite different in a way, isn't it, from the way sort of the medical establishment, I suppose, might give us. Because when you're breastfeeding, you're constantly given advice on what to do or not to do. Some of it by people who, I remember having my middle one and somebody coming to the house and saying, you really shouldn't have had a curry last night. And I was thinking, like,
because Indian mums don't breastfeed.
Exactly. I was thinking, this is something I eat all the time. This is something that
absolutely
I'm sure she's going to like.
Yeah, well, she's already been having it when she was in utero. She would.
Yes.
Yeah. There is an awful lot of nonsense that is spouted around what women should and shouldn't do when breastfeeding. But the other thing that is, I think, really quite unique is breastfeeding is the first time that you're using your body in such a, oh gosh, I'm not quite sure what the word is, but in a way that is entirely creative,
primeval
of life. Yeah, absolutely. It's primeval. And we go from, as particularly young women, which is when your breasts are not seen as something that are practical. They are there for decoration. They are there to attract attention, whether that is wanted or unwanted. And for some women, breastfeeding can be a real healing thing to do. And that, again, is something that sometimes comes up in meetings, talking about what women have been through as a result of having breasts and being female. That has nothing to do with having babies. But breastfeeding is, as I say, it can be something that can be either triggering for some mums who have been subjected to male violence and sexual violence, or it can be healing. And that's something, again, that you don't want to be talking about with men around. And it all comes back to that every time. It's something that women talk about among women, and that's really important.
I mentioned in the introduction that you were editor of the magazine for Leche GB.
Yeah, I did that for nearly 5 years.
Right. So in a way, I think that really explains how you first became aware of the issue of gender ideology sort of pushing its way into the Leche League. Do you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, so I did some behind the scenes proofreading and editing of things that were for the breastfeeding counsellors, for leaders to start with. And then I was asked if I would be interested in taking over as editor of Breastfeeding Matters, which is what the member, it's called a newsletter for tax purposes, but it's in the form of a little magazine. I was asked if I would be interested in taking over that, and I did, and I loved it. It was such a huge privilege because what it's mostly made up of is stories from mums, quite frequently, who have had difficulties, problems breastfeeding that they have overcome. And it's a huge privilege reading what some mothers have overcome in order to either breastfeed at the breast or to make sure that their baby gets their milk. The articles that I had from mothers, they were almost entirely throughout the 5 years that I was editor using mother-centered language. They were all almost entirely in the in the first person, so it didn't particularly come up. But when talking about groups, going to groups, and when talking about other mothers, it was all mums, mothers, women. But what I noticed over the time was that the change of language from other leaders who were writing things as a leader, they changed from talking about mothers and breastfeeding to talking about mothers and, or talking about breastfeeding families, which I wasn't comfortable with, particularly because I don't know about your family, but in my family, my husband didn't do any breastfeeding. That was all me. So what I found was that leaders were using the additive language initially, but as was being imposed by the LLL international policy of using a variety of terms. And I became less and less comfortable with this. So yeah, it became more and more frequent. And finally, the thing that pushed me over the edge was a piece that I was asked to include by a leader. We had a regular feature introducing a leader just to say how they found LLL and what they did and all of that. And it ended up by talking about supporting families or parents with infant feeding choices. This was in a breastfeeding support charity, a mother-to-mother breastfeeding support charity. And I just thought, I can't do this anymore. Because what I had said is, I'm not going to change the language that people choose to use, women, because it is almost exclusively women. Very occasionally there's something from a father in there. But so I had a conversation with the then publications director, having said I will finish the issue that we're working on at the moment, but then I'm stepping down, and this is why. And we talked about various things, including language and how important it is. And when you're talking about breastfeeding, firstly, it's mothers who breastfeed. It's not families. It's not parents. It is mothers. Those mothers might not identify as mothers. And if that's the case, fine. For those individuals, you use whatever language is comfortable for them, and that's fine on an individual basis. But when you are talking about a population, then you use the word that applies to the population, which here is mothers. And it matters for safety reasons, among other things. If you talk about mothers and parents, or when it comes to co-sleeping, for example, which a lot of breastfeeding mums do end up doing, either by design or they just end up doing it, it makes a difference whether that mother is breastfeeding, whether that mother is actually the mother. Breastfeeding by LLL International no longer means breastfeeding. They've talked about how, in order to be exclusive, breastfeeding could mean expressing and feeding exclusively by bottle, well, that mum is doing a fabulous thing for her baby if she can't breastfeed directly at the breast, or even if she chooses not to for whatever reason. But it won't result in the same behaviours while sleeping as a mum who is actually breastfeeding, feeding her baby at the breast. And it certainly wouldn't be the case for a bloke who identifies as the mother to be co-sleeping with that baby. And if you start using words to mean things that they don't, it can result in dangerous situations. And the less good chance of that baby continuing to be breastfed. So when you talk about skin to skin in the early hours after birth, that is something that can have a significant impact on the success of breastfeeding. When you start talking about mothers and parents doing that, again, it's no longer saying the same thing. And that is the part of the conversation that I had, and it was basically just dismissed. So yeah, that's why I stepped down as the editor of Breastfeeding Matters and decided, along with some other women, to stand as a trustee to see if we could do anything from within from that point of view.
So you stood down for the newsletter, but you were
Yeah.
still a counsellor at that point.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you stayed on as a counsellor, and you were standing as a trustee. What happened to that?
Later that year, a group of us stood at the AGM to become trustees. We were elected. That meant that the balance on the council of directors of those who had concerns about what was happening in terms of inclusion, very much in inverted commas, was fairly well balanced between those who think that inclusion should mean include as many mothers as possible, and those who think inclusion should be include everyone, which in a breastfeeding organisation, not appropriate. So the policy that was coming down from LLL International talked about supporting everybody, no matter their gender identity, sex, that one being key, and then a whole load of other things which nobody would have any issue with. And what we knew was that the charitable objects for La Leche League Great Britain were very clear and used sex-based language, and the beneficiaries are mothers and babies. And while there may be contention in law about what a woman is, there is no contention in law about what a mother is. And a mother is the biological mother who gives birth. That is the mother, which for us made it pretty clear that we couldn't just impose policy, because when you run a charity, you have to do it for the benefit of beneficiaries and not the people who you'd like to include. So we tried to do that, and the word Orwellian is overused, I think, but we were in the situation where a policy that we needed to talk about as trustees of a charity was being used against us to stop us talking about that policy. So we were told we couldn't use words, we couldn't refer to biological males, because that was harmful. And it was very difficult to deal with this.
Did you resign at that point once you?
No, we were battling away at that point.
You're very tenacious.
Yeah, we were a group, which made a huge difference.
Yeah.
And some of those who believed that we were harmful resigned, which meant that we had a majority, very, very small majority of trustees who believed that we should be sticking to the charitable objects and the original mission of La Leche League, and that the law would back us up in terms of what we really would be allowed to do. So there was a initially were told of complaints against us and that we were harmful. And it was all about language. It was all about stating that we believed that biological men were not our beneficiaries, that sort of thing. Part of the complaints against some of us was that we had voted for the wrong person to be co-opted as a trustee, eminently qualified woman. And then one of our number wrote an email to LLL International, or had done previously, to express concerns and ask questions about this conflict between the policy of including everybody and our charitable objects, which very much didn't. And we voted in the trustees and the Council of Directors to share this correspondence, the response to which hadn't answered any of the concerns or questions, had already been shared with LLLGB leaders, and which had provoked questions about what was going on. So we took a vote in the Council of Directors to share all of the correspondence, to show what the concerns were, what the discussions that were being had were. And as a result of passing that vote, sharing that correspondence with GB leaders, we were suspended. A group of us were suspended by LLL International. So that was an action we took as trustees. But because LLL-GB is a UK charity, independent, LLL International had no power over us as trustees because we were elected officials. So they suspended us as breastfeeding counsellors, which is nothing to do with what we were doing. Along with that, or as a result of that, and as a result of what was happening within the Council of Directors, those who had deemed what we had done harmful, who had voted against it, spoke out, said, we did not vote for this, we think it's harmful. If you are on the board of a charity, if you don't agree with the decision, you can make sure that your objections are noted, you can step down, you can report something to the Charity Commission. What you can't do is say, this is wrong, I voted against this, this is not okay. But that's what a group of them did, they now being in the minority at the time. So that's what we were dealing with, both in international and in GB. There was an EGM with resolutions to try to get rid of us as trustees.
EGM, Extraordinary General Meeting.
Extraordinary General Meeting, yes, with resolutions which did not pass, but it wasn't, it was fairly close, but none of us were voted out. Around about the same time, immediately after the EGM, when we weren't voted out, the remaining trustees who were of a different opinion all stepped down. So we did at least have a really lovely Council of Directors all pulling in the same direction, having disagreements. We didn't agree on everything, but we were clear about the objects. And what we did was we commissioned a KC opinion, so a legal opinion from a King's Counsel, asking about the position of the charity as it stood and what it would mean in practical terms, what it would mean if it was decided by a vote, which was what would be needed to change in order to implement the policy of including everyone, which is what LLL International was saying we had to do. We disagreed, but we wanted to know what it would take to do that. So we had that KC opinion, which basically told us, yes, you're right. Trans women are not your beneficiaries. Trans men are, if they've given birth. And it laid out what we believe to be the case in very plain terms that it would be unlawful to implement the policy that LLL International was saying we had to. While all this was going on, because getting a legal opinion, it's not something I knew anything about, or any of us knew anything about. It takes time. And in the meantime, we had just about received the opinion around the time when the complaint against us, for which goalposts had changed, and it was no longer about what we'd said and the words we'd used. It was now about the fact that we'd spoken to the press, which we did at the same time.
Yeah.
Earlier, when we had made a serious incident report to the Charity Commission about the complete breakdown in governance within LLLGB, with those who were saying, no, we don't agree with this vote that's just been taken and carried. And yeah, so there was so much going on all at the same time. It's certainly been the most stressful year of my life.
I can imagine. I mean, it must have been just terrible, because luckily you did have colleagues to work with, but
Absolutely.
just things like raising money for things such as a KC review, all of those things are expensive and they're stressful. You've got to get everybody's diaries lined up, and
yeah, we were fortunate that a donor paid for the KC opinion.
Well, that is fortunate.
But all of that was going on at the same time, and then with LLL International still pursuing us, having changed the goalpost so that now it was about talking to the press, which we had done, because half of a board of trustees of a UK charity, breastfeeding charity, being suspended for saying we don't think this is quite possible. It's news. So we did speak to journalists, and then we were vilified for that, and for disparaging LLL, which we don't believe we did. We expressed concerns about the conflict and the fact that the Leche GB charitable objects were in conflict with policy, but I don't think that's disparaging. It's stating facts. And we just about got the KC opinion when LLL International pushed through what they'd been trying to do from quite early on, essentially, which was get rid of us. And we had our accreditation as LLL leaders taken from us. If I remember rightly, it was September, October time. Although we were at that point still trustees, because that's
been
not
very
something
stressful. A lot of your life wrapped up in something so worthy, and then to just have that taken away from you.
Yeah.
I've got lots more questions, but I haven't got time. My allotted time is up. I've got to pass across to Beck, so speak later.
Thank you, Jane. It's been really fascinating listening to the importance of being able to use clear language, and also the right of women and mothers to have their own space to discuss breastfeeding and related issues. There is another side to this debate, and that is a growing increase in men who identify as trans women that wish to breastfeed their own children. And this is achieved using what's been described as a cocktail of hormones, with very little research, seemingly, on how safe that is for the infants involved. Were you aware of this during your time in the Leche League? And what is your perspective on this side of the discussion?
Yes, absolutely. It is the case that there is very little evidence as to whether it's safe. But for me, talking about biological males and wanting to breastfeed, what the milk or fluid that they can induce using hormones and drugs, that for me is a distraction. For me, that is an issue to talk about when you're looking at what trans men do in terms of taking hormones in order to suppress some of the biological functions of being female. When it comes to men breastfeeding babies, what the fluid is a distraction from the fact that the act itself is a massive safeguarding red flag. It's there's so many levels. At best, a man wanting to breastfeed would be in order to bond with the baby. Well, there are plenty of other ways that a man can bond with a baby. You can do everything except breastfeed, basically. There's a really lovely thing in the Womanly Art of Breastfeeding, which is the latest edition, is now The Art of Breastfeeding. But it talks about dads are the first people that babies know who that love comes without food. Which is a really lovely idea, I think. And they can do the carrying, they can do the snuggling, they can do the bathing, they can do the changing the nappies, they can do everything else. But when you have a man wanting to breastfeed, it's not about the baby. As I say, at very best, it's wanting to bond with that child, but it's more likely to be wanting affirmation of an identity. And at worst, it is just outright abuse, because there are men for whom inducing lactation and wanting to be seen as a woman, as a mother, is a fetish. And that is using a baby as a tool to feed that fetish. And that's just abuse. It's purely and simply, for me, safeguarding is much more of an issue, to the extent that we shouldn't even be talking about what's in the milk, because it shouldn't be happening from a safeguarding point of view. Yeah.
So that's really interesting, because I'd never actually considered that side of things, that trans identifying women, or trans mascs, trans men, non binary, whatever they would like to call themselves, are also taking hormones and are also suppressing natural female hormones that could impact the production or quality of milk. Has there been any research on that you're aware of?
To be honest, I don't know. I'm not aware of any, but I'm not a scientist. I'm not an IBCLC. I'm not it's like the next step up from a breastfeeding counsellor. Breastfeeding counsellors are all about helping mums with the normal course of breastfeeding and normal issues that you might come across, and you would refer on if there's anything more complicated. But not that I'm aware of. But what research I am aware of, that doesn't seem to be an issue that is being considered. It seems to be, well, this man, this trans man, wants to breastfeed, but the dysphoria means that they've got to keep taking the hormones, which to me makes no sense, because if you genuinely consider yourself to be a man, why are you wanting to breastfeed a baby? Because men don't do that, or they certainly shouldn't. If there's no hormones involved, and then I would have no issue whatsoever in supporting a trans man to breastfeed a baby, or anyone who identified as non-binary, if they've given birth and want to breastfeed. I'd call it whatever you want as an individual. But yeah, so that's where I stand on that side of things. I don't see how it would be possible to ethically carry out any research about the effects on baby without that baby, who absolutely can't consent, to being part of some kind of experiment with potentially significant results. Because if you're talking about hormones, we've got no idea what impact that's going to have at puberty. And yeah, I can't see how it could be done ethically.
Absolutely. And I think there's a common theme here where children are being decentered in a really concerning way. Research that I've looked at, it often sort of centres around the experiences or the needs of the trans identifying parents in these situations. Like you say, why are we doing such a terrible job of safeguarding children, infants, on this issue?
That's a really good question. If I knew the answer to that, then maybe we could sort it. I think we have become very concentrated on what individuals want, and we're told that we can do anything we want to, which up to a point is maybe true, but it's not possible to do everything. And it doesn't mean that we can't or that we shouldn't consider the impact on others, particularly those who we are entirely responsible for. And we hear a lot about the most vulnerable group, quite often in relation to trans people. When you compare trans men, trans women to newborns, neither of them are vulnerable, really, not in the same way. And to subject babies who there's no way they can opt out of anything because they don't have a choice about if they're going to survive, and we all have an incredibly strong survival instinct. They're going to feed what's given to them. They have no other option. So to take the baby out of the equation, which is also what's happening when you look at language, because frequently now we hear it's about lactation, it's about human milk feeding, however you do it. That's taking both of the two people who should be absolutely centered in breastfeeding support, the mother and the baby. It's just removing them from the picture. And it makes it so much harder, as in many other spheres. If you can't talk about the problem, if you can't talk about the people who you need to talk about, it makes it nigh on impossible to have any meaningful discussion.
What strikes me as well on this topic is there seems to be a real resistance to doing anything towards building a bed of evidence here. And that seems to largely be coming from the top down. What's that about? Is it a fear of offending people or a fear of what they may uncover?
That's a really good question. um, I think we are, particularly as women, very much socialized to be kind, and we are told that other people their needs and wants should be put first. And as mothers, that's appropriate when we have, certainly when we have babies and small children, they have needs rather than wants. Obviously, that changes as they grow into toddlers and teenagers and beyond. But babies don't have anything other than needs. There, it's entirely appropriate, making sure obviously you still need to look after yourself and make sure you've got support with practically and in terms of mental health and so on. But we do have to put babies first when we are mothers. And I don't know, maybe that pushes over into that idea of being kind, and to the point that it subverts what is good for us and our children. And I know in some cases it will be because there's someone in the family, a young person who identifies as trans, and therefore it's harder to think rationally about what's happening when you have someone who you love who's tied up in this and what they may want when they grow up. And for young women who are identifying as trans, and in many cases we know it's because they are on the autistic spectrum, or they are trying to run away from what they've been subjected to as young girls and women. they're putting themselves through something that means they are being robbed of something that is really important as a mother. Now, not everyone wants to breastfeed, but what women go through in terms of their experience of breastfeeding, particularly if they wanted to and didn't, quite often because they were let down by the system or didn't get the support at the right time, it still matters to a lot of women decades later. It is something that is, there's a biological urge to do it. Otherwise, we wouldn't have survived as a species. If there wasn't that urge to breastfeed, we wouldn't have evolved to and still be around. So yeah, I don't know. I think it is an extension, a massive, massive, massive overreach of the idea of being kind, which I think possibly we're more susceptible to because of socialization as women.
And in the end, the kindness is to everyone except ourselves and the children involved at the centre of this issue. There has been one particularly frustrating study I've seen, which had a lone participant, and it was a man who had a trans identity and wanted to feed his child. They cited in that study that there was very little research on the safety or content of the fluid being produced, but didn't take the time to send a sample to the lab and do some research themselves to see if it was even ethical to proceed with this study, which was following his self proclaimed motivations for wanting to breastfeed and his emotional experience of that journey, and the success rate being measured by his emotional outcomes and his experience. There was so little consideration for the child, but even more so, so little consideration for the safety. We're so unwilling to look into this. It is concerning.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that when I stepped down as editor of Breastfeeding Matters, we talked about language. Another thing that we talked about in that conversation was the lack of research about the safety of a male breastfeeding in terms of the milk. And what the leader who I was talking to, what she said was, well, they use the same protocol as women who induce lactation, which is possible for mums who adopt, for example. So it is possible to induce lactation in a woman who has never given birth. It's more common to use it for a woman who has previously breastfed. It's more successful then as well to relactate. So what the woman I was talking to said, well, they use the same protocol, so there is research. And when I pointed out that the physiology is different and we know that there's a massive data gap. You only have to read Caroline Criado Perez's book. We know there's a data gap in medications and the research on that. And this is something that is used for women on female biology around something that is to do with the female reproductive system. And there was the fact that she considered that research that's on women to be fine just to apply to men who are taking the same medications in order to induce lactation of a sort. Just, I found it absolutely mind-boggling that the lack of thinking of any sort, never mind clear thinking, just the lack of thinking about it was, yeah,
It seems like there's a level of anti-scientific thinking here where you're not even allowed to acknowledge the difference between men and women, even when it's, clearly very significant.
and that is the kind of thing that we were told it was harmful to say.
What level of safeguarding would we normally see? Because with other medications or courses of treatment, you often see if you're pregnant, if you're breastfeeding, consult your GP in the leaflets. And it seems that there's less safeguarding in place here than what you might typically see, where treatment courses that have been in use for far, far longer in this way are still supervised or have some level of oversight from a GP for breastfeeding mums. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yes. Yes, absolutely. There is research to some extent on some medications, but it's not ethical to do research on women who are breastfeeding because it's not. If you're trying to find out if something is safe for the baby, you can't do an experiment with a baby to find out if it's true. But there are resources out there. There's Wendy Jones with the BFN medications help, used to be a helpline. I think it's just emails now. And there's a lot known both from experience and testing, because in terms of the molecules of a drug, you can tell how much can pass through to the milk depending on the size of the molecules. So that's not a scientist, but that's one of the things that I know does have an impact on whether something's safe or not. So yeah, there's a very strict atmosphere, it's not quite the right word, but idea around what breastfeeding mums can and can't take when breastfeeding. And that just seems to go completely out the window when you say the word trans, whether it's for a biological mother or whether it's for a man who wants to induce lactation and breastfeed a baby. There doesn't seem to be anything like the same oversight or concern. I read recently about a trans woman, I think it's in Canada, who has HIV and who is inducing lactation in order to feed a baby. Now, there is research around mothers with HIV breastfeeding babies, because in some parts of the world, that can mean whether a baby is breastfed or not can mean the difference between life and death. And we know that if a mother with HIV with a undetectable viral load breastfeeds and does so exclusively, and that bit's really important, it is safe for the baby. Or certainly the risks outweigh, the benefits rather outweigh the risks. There is research on that. And there's a man in Canada going, oh, well, it'll be fine. And apparently the hospital or even social services not going, no, that's not okay, because we know that males can induce lactation. We also know that the amount that they can induce is nowhere near enough to sustain a baby. So that baby cannot possibly be exclusively breastfed. That's even if this fluid that we don't know whether that's safe in and of itself because of the hormones and the medications involved. But it's, yeah, the oversight, why that baby is not being taken away for safeguarding reasons is beyond me. Yeah, it's say the word trans and safeguarding just seems to disappear.
I mean, it's really concerning. This goes beyond safeguarding, really, doesn't it? This is actually human experimentation without consent on a really concerning scale, and it's human experimentation on babies. A comparable situation, perhaps, could be thalidomide that was used to prevent morning sickness, but the difference there is that there was a support for research into the risks and into the harms. Once those were identified, maybe the response wasn't as swift as it could have been, but it did cease to be used. There was also compensation paid for the children who are experiencing this. How can they ever hope to be compensated when it was their own father or their own trans identifying mother who chose to take this risk with them if years down the line we find that actually this has been incredibly harmful?
Absolutely. And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, the thing is with something like the thalidomide, it was done for beneficial reasons. I mean, it was completely wrong because of the side effects that were the case. But here there's no benefit. It's not as though there is a problem that we need to solve, and this is something that might help. It's I want to do this, so let's do it. So I can see what you mean by comparable, but it's also completely not.
For women who are listening to this and who are concerned and want to get involved, what can we do? What needs to change?
Oh, that is a very good question, and I wish I knew the answer. We need women to push back when language is not right to be called out. We need mothers who are going along to breastfeeding support meetings to ask very clearly, is this a single sex space? And make it clear that that's what they want. And in a more self-interested way, we would like support for our new organisation that we are setting up, because that's where we're at. We tried to maintain La Leche League as the mother-to-mother breastfeeding support organisation that it was set up as, and we know that this is not what was intended, because Marion Thompson, the founder who resigned over this last autumn, has said so. So we are starting a new organisation. It takes time to do this. It will be mother-to-mother breastfeeding support. We are in the process of registering it. We're not quite ready to announce more yet, but we are going to need support in order to pay for the insurance that's needed to run meetings, to sort out a website, to pay for venues in order to hold meetings for mothers, to give that single sex, because breastfeeding, mother-to-mother support that it should be. So do that too when the time comes, and I'll appreciate you helping spread the word.
That's great to hear. I was wondering what was next and whether there would be an attempt to create an organisation like the one you've just described. So I'm really happy to hear that that's what you're going to be doing, and I'm sure lots of our listeners are too. Really good luck with that. So now we finish with the same question we ask every week.
I know.
So, if women have been listening and have taken an interest, are there any lesser heard voices that you would like to highlight, or do you have a woman of the moment that you would encourage people to research or look into themselves?
It's so hard. One woman who I would have said you've already had on is Ruth Dineen with Hague Mothers. No, the thing that I would like to say is that while we've been through this, we've reached out to women and said, help. And they've said, how? Or they've said, yes, of course, this is what you need and we can help with it. So people like Lisa Marie Taylor from Filia, like Helen Joyce, like Julie Bindle, like journalists, Sanchez Manning, who I spoke to and did an article about what was going on. So yeah, I don't think there's a lesser known one that I'm aware of, but just following people and talking about it with your friends.
Your woman of the moment is the sisterhood, really.
Yes, that's a lovely way to put it. Thank you. Yes, I knew that question was coming, and it had been whirring around in my mind for quite some time, and I hadn't managed to get anywhere with it. But yeah, absolutely, because we got in touch and said, can you help? And absolutely everyone we reached out to basically said yes. And that has made a massive, massive difference to us.
There's an amazing community out here. That's true.
Definitely. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your time. This has been really fascinating.
Oh, it's been great, actually.
Thank
It's
you.
a very important issue for a lot of people. It's stirred up a lot of memories for me. And as you said earlier, it's the type of thing that is fundamental to your understanding of yourself as a woman and a mother.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely fascinating. And thank you to our listeners for making it this far into the episode. If you want to learn more about Ruth's new organisation, keep an eye on this space. You can follow us at InsightfulPod, and we'll definitely be sharing updates as she sends them to us. You can also follow her on social media that will be linked on our Twitter page. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do like, share, comment, subscribe, all them good things to help spread the word. Thank you.